So good evening, everybody. We have now reached 6 o'clock, so we can begin. And it's a delight to welcome you here. My name's Charlie Jeffries, Senior Vice Principal of the University of Edinburgh. And the delight is to welcome you to a double-hatted lecture. In part, it is the appearance of a distinguished speaker in the Distinguished Speaker Series of the International Institute for Cultural Relations, and in part it is a Crystal Macmillan lecture. A word or two about both of those hats the lecture is wearing. The International Institute for Cultural Relations is a fairly new research and engagement centre in the University of Edinburgh. Its inaugural director is Professor J.P. Singh, who has enlivened an idea that we had. We didn't know quite whether the idea would fly, but it's certainly flying due to the impetus that he's given it. We're interested in the Institute in the impacts of culture, broadly defined, including the creative arts, on international relations. We think culture, broadly defined, influences values, worldviews, structures of relationships between different groups, and that has a manifestation in the way that states and their societies relate to one another. This is one of the first lectures in that Distinguished Speaker Series, so it's great to have it. Crystal Macmillan. Now, Crystal Macmillan is a fantastic figure in the history of the University of Edinburgh. And she became the nameplate, as it were, of the School of Social and Political Science at the university when it moved into a refurbished building back in 2008 on George Square. Now, those of you who know the university will know that we have a long tradition of naming academic buildings in George Square after eminent 18th century men. And that's quite right, because those eminent 18th century men, William Robertson, Adam Ferguson and so on, were absolutely foundational figures for this university. But so, in a different era, was Crystal Macmillan. There's an exhibition downstairs, which I'm sure you will have a good look at afterwards. I'm going to hand over at this point to Fiona Mackay, the outgoing head of the School of Social and Political Science, to say a little bit more about Crystal Macmillan and why she is that foundational figure and why we honour her name in one of our most prestigious lectures at the university. So, Fiona, over to you.
Thank you, Charlie. And can I extend a very warm welcome on behalf of the School of Social and Political Science and the Institute of International Cultural Relations. Before I speak a little bit about Crystal Macmillan, I'll say that our lecturer tonight will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we have about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A. And afterwards, everybody's welcome to stay for a soft drink or a glass of wine downstairs. I can't think of a more fitting person to meet the twin profiles that we needed to have a joint lecture here today. So on the one hand, feminism, women's leadership, gender justice, and on the other hand, the soft power of arts and culture globally. The Crystal Macmillan Lecture Series is held in honour of Crystal Macmillan, who was a suffragist, a global feminist, a barrister, not a barrier, and a pacifist. And what she does, what we want to do, we wanted to honour her, but also the values of social justice, the values of gender equality, the values of human rights going forwards. As Charlie said, she was a remarkable graduate of the University of Edinburgh. She was the first female to ever graduate in science from the university in 1896 in mathematics. And in 1908, she made history again as the first woman to plead a case before the House of Lords. She was presenting the case that female university graduates of this university should be regarded as persons under the parliamentary franchise legislation and should be given the right to vote. She was described in newspapers at the time as a modern-day Portia. She lost the case, but she apparently won the argument. Apparently one of those listening said it was the best speech he had ever heard, but nonetheless the law lords decided that women were not persons, and it took another 10 years before women were granted partial franchise, and of course about 20 years before they got equal rights. Crystal was a prominent voice in the global women's movement throughout her life, and she campaigned on a range of issues, including political and economic equality, women's human rights and citizenship, and peace. She was a prominent member of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance and went on to co-found the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, which was created in order to try and bring about peace during the First World War. She was also a founding member of the Open Door International, which campaigned for women workers' rights. As Charlie said, in 2008, she rather surprisingly became the first woman after whom an Edinburgh University building had been named. Her passion, her commitment and her boldness to stride out on the world stage was inspired in part by her earlier education at St Leonard's School for Girls, which was set up in 1877 by female educationalists and campaigners for women's right to higher education. The aim of the school was that girls should receive an education that is as good as her brothers, if not better. And it was part of a global movement of schools and women's colleges in the UK, in Europe, and in North America, like Barnard College for Women in New York. And this, I think, provides a living link, if you like, between Crystal Macmillan and our speaker tonight. Before taking up her current position as the 10th president of the Lincoln Center for Performing Arts in New York, Debora Spar was president of Barnard College, a liberal arts college for women affiliated with Columbia University. And when it was founded in 1889, Barnard was one of the very few American colleges where women could expect to receive the same challenging education as men. In that proud tradition of empowerment and inclusion, during her 9-year tenure, President Spar increased the international profile of her college. She attracted a more racially diverse student body. She broadened the school's admissions policy to include transgendered women. She expanded and improved the college's leadership initiative, setting up the Athena Centre for Leadership Studies, and she worked to boost the role of the arts on campus, including the introduction of artists in residence. She also, by the time she had left, had built up a $300 million endowment fund, and I know what I want to speak to her about at dinner. Like Crystal Macmillan, Debora has broken glass ceilings and forged new paths. She's the first woman president of the Lincoln Center, which is one of the most prestigious arts institutions in the world. The fact that I'm the first female leader is kind of a nice footnote, she has said. I'm also the first academic leader, so I almost think that that's an equally big first. So her appointment has been seen as path-shaping in a number of senses, including, I think, setting out a new model for the administration of iconic arts institutions, more inclusive, but also recognising the synergies with and the lessons to be learnt from other cultural institutions like the Academy. Speaking at the time of her appointment in March this year, Professor Spar, who has written about technological innovation in the arts and is a lifelong art lover, and I am led to believe a frustrated dancer, said that she looked forward to reimagining what a performing arts centre needs to be for new audiences, adding that the more tumultuous the times, the more vibrant and important the arts need to be. She describes her career as non-linear. She was a professor before the Lincoln Arts Centre and before Barnard. She was a professor at Harvard Business School for 17 years. She holds a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and a master's degree and PhD in government from Harvard. She has written about the economics of human fertility, the evolution of the internet, as well as on AIDS, African economics, the global economy, the balance of power, and terrorism. She is the author of 7 books, including Wonder Women, Sex, Power and the Quest for Perfection, and Ruling the Waves, From the Compass to the Internet. Friends and colleagues, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Debora Spar, who will deliver her lecture entitled The Virgin and the Plow, How Technology Shapes Who We Are and How We Live and Love. Thank you.
Thank you for such an incredibly generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here today and back in the place that I consider one of my very, very favorite cities on the planet. It is also a great pleasure to be reunited with my friend J.P. Singh. We met in the early 1990s when we were both working on projects of international collaboration. And so I think the fact that we've wound up here today proves that great minds think alike, and that they eventually settle on projects that are connected to arts and culture and the role they play in shaping our lives and the world around us. Today, though, as my colleague just hinted at, I'm not going to speak directly about the arts. Instead, I'm going to be talking about a current project that predates my current job. And it's a project that, for the first time ever in my life, brings together various streams of research and analysis from my other, admittedly rather far-flung projects. As you just heard, I'm not a linear person. I haven't had a linear career, and my books are kind of all over the map. Isaiah Berlin, I believe, once famously said that all academics are either foxes or hedgehogs. The hedgehogs who burrow down and the foxes who roam wide. I'm a fox, for better or worse. But what I'm trying to do here in this book is to draw upon these early bodies of research that I did, stretching from the internet to reproductive medicine to the changing role and identity of women. So it's not a neat subject. It's not a little book. It's probably not a book one should undertake when one has also taken on another big job in a completely different field. But we'll let my mother beat me up about that. But it has been an amazingly fun book to begin work on. And it brings, I hope, a different lens on some basic questions. And it brings a lens from an atypical scholar, which is really how I consider myself. And it brings, I hope, a new, or at least a repositioned way of thinking about the overlap between technology and society. The key argument is that nearly all the decisions we make in our most intimate lives, whom to marry, how to have children, how to have sex, how to think about love and romance and families and sex, are driven and always have been driven by technology. We think we're behaving as fully autonomous individuals. We think we're pushing or advocating for social change, but we're actually just being swept up in and responding to much broader shifts in technology, or to what Marx and his kin would have termed the changing means of production. The book follows a largely Marxist argument with heavy doses of feminism put in, which is sort of strange, because academically I'm not a Marxist. I taught at Harvard Business School for 17 years, which probably guarantees I'm not a Marxist. And within the feminist world, I am, sadly, generally now referred to as a white corporate feminist, which I detest, but I think that probably refers back to Harvard Business School again. But the reason I feel so strongly about bringing a Marxist and a feminist, quasi-Marxist, let's call it, and quasi-feminist perspective into the area of technology is that neither of those perspectives show up in the fields of technology. Instead, generally, when you read books or blogs or articles about technology, they're written by technologists or people who really bring a scientific, technological perspective, understandably, to the work we're doing. But I think that you actually get a very different and broader and more useful perspective on technology, and critically on how technology involves our most intimate lives by bringing these other perspectives to the fore. It is a provocative argument by nature, and I should confess this is the first time I'm going public with it. So if I get it all wrong, you can tell me over cocktails afterwards. But let me begin by just giving you 3 of the arguments I'm making. Again, they are being written to be provocative, but I think they're pretty intriguing. The first argument, and these are not in any particular order, these are actually examples more than arguments. But one of the things I'm arguing is that marriage as we have come to know it, traditional marriage, if you will, heterosexual, monogamous, till death do us part marriage, was a creation of the plow, or more precisely, of the plow-enabled agriculture that emerged during the Neolithic transformation of around 8000 BC. That's the first of several arguments. The second one, which is going to get me into lots of trouble with my former colleagues at Barnard, is that feminism was enabled and enhanced by 3 crucial technologies of the mid-20th century: the automobile, household appliances, and most crucially, the pill. So advocates like Crystal McMillan played a fundamental role, I'm arguing, but so too did technological change. And the third one, and I'll talk more about this one later, and this is the one where I think I'm going the farthest out on the limb, but I find it really intriguing, is that the legalization of same-sex marriage was facilitated, or at least accelerated, by the emergence of reproductive technologies, and specifically by reproductive technologies that allowed same-sex couples, and particularly men, to become parents. In all of these cases, I'm going to argue, the standard narrative around the social change or around the social structure downplays, or in many cases just ignores, the role of technology. When we think of marriage in a casual way, we think of it as something sort of natural. You know, it just exists. When we look at the way marriage changes, particularly around the changing role of women and of same-sex marriage, we tend to think about those changes as have been driven particularly by changes in norms or political activism. We think of feminism or fights for transgender rights similarly as products of social movements, of activists and advocates pushing history and society along some modern and progressive paths. And to a large extent, of course, that's true. But what I'm arguing, and it's really meant as a compliment rather than a contradiction, is that history's arc is also driven, and may perhaps be, in some cases, primarily driven by the much larger and sweeping shifts in technology. Things like the shift from nomadism to settled agriculture, the rise and eventual decline of the industrial economy, the creation of computers and artificial intelligence. We acknowledge all of these developments as crucially important technological changes, but rarely do we trace through the technological change and how it affects the personal and intimate realm. This is what I'm trying to do in this new book. More precisely, I am claiming and will hope to demonstrate that what we think of as social structures, how we build our families and select our partners and raise our children, are actually the remnants of technological change. As technology evolves, I'm arguing, so too at a fundamental human level do we. The book proceeds in 3 parts, rather obviously. The first is the past, in which I look at the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and then the mid-century modern developments. The present, where I look at artificial reproduction, the changing role of men, and how increasingly dating and sex are moving online. Sort of a horrifying perspective to those of us who have children in that age range. And then the future, where I look at the shift away from the binary in terms of gender. I look at robots, and I look at the end of death. And what I'm basically trying to do here is, if I can convince you that this argument works in the past, then I think I can offer some interesting analysis of the present and hopefully a little bit of predictive power about the future. And so what I want to do today is I just want to trace through the argument in one of each of those 3 periods. So I want to look at the shift to Neolithic agriculture and what that meant for marriage, the rise of reproductive technologies, and then the rise of robots. I've picked these chapters in part because I think they're particularly interesting, but also because they're the three I've written. So if you ask me about the others, I'm going to be a little bit weaker. But let me start with Neolithic agriculture. And in purely scholarly terms, this is the hardest argument to make, in part because this is not an area of scholarship that I know anything about, really, and because it's figuring out what happened 8,000 years ago is tougher than figuring out what happened during the Industrial Revolution. But the archaeological and anthropological evidence that has emerged from life during those times is pretty convincing, and that's the work that I'm drawing upon here. So the basic story runs as follows. Prior to around 8,000 BC, there's confusion about the dates, but let's call it 8,000 BC for argument's sake. Humans and their ancestors lived nomadically, and that we know quite conclusively. Our ancestors foraged for food, and they moved along with their food sources. Men and women mated, obviously, but not in permanent unions. Women obviously bore the children, and we believe bonded with them, but living arrangements were communal in bands of 20 to 30 people, most people suspect. And the bands, they were not restricted to parent-child groups. So they were extended families, if you will. Women contributed over 50% of the group's calories, from the proverbial nuts and berries and fruits. Men, by contrast, contributed calories largely in the form of meat, but that food source was rarer. So women were actually the primary food gatherers in most times of the year. Men lived communally along with women and children, but men didn't appear to have any social links to their biological children because they didn't know who they were. Right? Women, of course, knew who their children were. Men didn't if they were having sex promiscuously. And for most groups, we perceive they didn't even know how children were created. So it was, that was a relatively more recent understanding. Around 8,000 BC, however, in certain fertile pockets of the world, the Valley of the Tigris and the Euphrates, along the Nile River, along the Yellow River, groups of these once nomadic peoples began to settle down, replacing the diet and lifestyle of nomadism with more permanent grain-based agriculture, and developing the tools, crucially the plow, but also carts and storage facilities, storage vessels for holding the grain. So if you go to any museum of the ancient world, one of the things you see most often is urns, things for holding grain. It was crucial technology. And the harvesting implements that enabled them to grow food rather than simply collecting it. And if you think about it for a moment, that's a massive technological breakthrough. To actually, we consider that normal, but growing food rather than finding it was a major shift in human history. Over time, the people of these early civilizations built homes and storage containers. They harvested grapes and figs, and they accumulated goods. The private property that had to be accounted for and maintained, and shortly thereafter taxed by the rulers who also grew up as a result of these technologies. You didn't really have a ruling class until you had a taxation system. And you didn't have a taxation system until you had things that could be taxed, which initially were grains. So every, a certain fragment of the grain had to be handed over to the tax collectors, which again, if you look at, the ancient archaeological record, there's an awful lot of tablets just calculating up grain harvests. That was the major thing that governments did. What happened as a result of these changes, though, was that suddenly humanity's first settlers needed their children. They needed their children to work in the fields, and they needed their children to inherit the private property that the family had now accumulated, which meant at a most fundamental level, they had to know who their children were. So for the first time in history, it becomes crucial that men know who their children are. So how do you do that? The only way in those days for men to know categorically who their children were was to control women's fertility. So it's from that desire, I'm arguing, and many other people have argued this as well, that's the desire, the need that gives way to marriage as we now know it. So what has to happen is that women are adored as virgins, and so you get the whole adoration of the virgin as a desirable thing to be. Those virgins are then married off young, now called wives, and they have to be kept monogamous until they die. That's the only way that a man can guarantee that the children who are born to that woman are his. Any other children he conceives with another woman he doesn't care about. But the way, the way to know that his children are his is to control women's fertility. So what I'm arguing here is that it was actually the quest for paternity that led to the establishment of the patriarchy. And it was the plow that set this whole thing in motion. So lots of complicated steps here, but there's pretty good evidence that these things happened. And if you go back and you look at early marriage contracts, they look like real estate deals. And you can still hear the echoes of that, particularly in things like the Orthodox Jewish ceremony, which has not changed all that much. The father gives the daughter to a man in exchange for, oftentimes there was an actual exchange of goods, but basically on the assurance that he will then take care of her for the rest of her life, and he owns the children. So that's the basic, ancient argument. So let me now jump all the way to the very recent past and tell you a little bit about reproductive technologies. So in 2006, I wrote a book called The Baby Business, which sketched out all the various ways in which technology now allows people to have babies via non-sexual means. And I achieved a very small bit of academic fame for having a slide that I took everywhere showing the 16 ways to have a baby, only one of which involves sex. And there's a certain Chinese menu component because you can buy your sperm, you can buy your eggs, you can have fresh eggs, you can have frozen eggs, you can have mixed together. There's a whole variety here. And laughing aside, this is kind of big news because for all of history, there was only one way to have a baby. And now, in a very short period of time, we came up with 15 other ones. And what I was arguing in that book was that this whole area of science and medicine was rapidly becoming a big business, which nobody wanted to talk about as a business. But it is a business, much less so in this country than in the US. But the current estimates is that this market, within the next few years, will be about $31 billion. So there is quite a big business around making babies. But I don't want to talk about the business here today. I want to talk about the science and how it's shifting social norms. So I can't resist just talking a little bit about the science because it is so incredible. But everybody knows what IVF is. IVF was the basic breakthrough technology that allowed babies to be born conceived in the laboratory rather than sexually. But the technologies are growing at very rapid paces, and this country actually does some of the best work on it, a couple of scientists here. But one of the most incredible technologies is something called PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And what you do there is IVF is done in the laboratory, and then at the very earliest stage, when the blastocyst is just 8 cells, a single cell is plucked out of the blastocyst and examined. And you can do DNA analysis on that single cell without damaging the blastocyst. And you can determine whether any given embryo carries the markers for certain genetic diseases. So if a family knows that they're at risk, for example, of producing a child with Tay-Sachs or cystic fibrosis, rather than rolling the dice and risking giving birth to a baby with the genetic mutation, you do IVF, you test the blastocysts, and then you can guarantee the parents a child who doesn't carry the genetic marker. So it's incredible, and you can also see how quickly it could also move in various undesirable ways. Although, to be honest, we've seen very little evidence that anyone is moving in bad ways. People really do this to prevent having children born with horrific diseases. Once you're doing that, though, picking gender is a piece of cake. So gender selection is going on all the time, but it's generally bundled in with people who are using PGD for other reasons. The other technology that's just now coming out of the lab, but is sort of head-spinningly interesting, is a technology called IVG, which is in vitro gametogenesis. And what this enables you to do is to take skin cells from any one of us, revert them to being pluripotent stem cells, and then use those stem cells to create either eggs or sperm. So just start thinking through the permutations here. Easier for women to do this than, no, easier for men to do this than women, because to create a sperm cell you need Y chromosome. But people will soon be, if the technology plays out, and I suspect it will, what will happen then is that same-sex couples can have babies who are genetically theirs. A group of 4 roommates can create a child who is genetically theirs. You can create a child your own. So I could create a sperm cell and an egg cell and then give birth to a child who is genetically my child, who was nearly a clone, but not quite a clone. So this technology has already been done in mice, and history indicates that once you can do most of this stuff in mice, you can do it in humans pretty quickly. So this stuff is happening, and it's been happening now for sort of 40 and 50 years. And some of the social causality, I think, is very, very obvious and totally non-controversial. So as a result of assisted reproductive technologies, couples can have babies much later in life. And one of the big sort of social trends in Manhattan right now is young professional women freezing their eggs. You know, I don't want to have a baby until I make partner, until I get tenure. So you go, they actually have egg freezing parties. You get like cocktails that have these puns attached to them, and then you freeze your eggs. I know a lot of people who are sort of doing it for their daughters as, you know, happy 35th birthday, freeze your egg, which creates another whole realm of mother-daughter tension. But it's out there, and it's shifting the social dynamics in interesting ways. Obviously now, it's much easier for women and men to have babies on their own because they can use either donated eggs or sperm banks or some combination of the above. And I'll talk more about this in a second. Crucially, it's become far more easy for same-sex couples to have children using assisted reproductive technologies. We have, as I mentioned earlier, generations now of children who have been born without genetic diseases that would have killed them in the past. And we have this much touted, but I would argue much less real fear that at some point we'll start creating designer babies. We haven't seen that. What we've seen is parents creating the children they would have had naturally, but just using technology to do so. And I suspect that will continue to be the use pattern. So I think that part I shouldn't have to argue very hard for. Science has changed and social norms have changed as a result. What I want to tack on to this argument, as I said, I think this is the most provocative piece of what I'm arguing, but I find it just really intriguing to imagine or to look at, is that I think ART, assisted reproductive technologies, played a crucial and largely ignored role in shaping debates over marriage equality. So generally, the causal narrative that one hears around same-sex marriage and the battle for marriage equality was that assisted reproductive technologies were sort of happening in the lab in the 1980s and 1990s was when they were really developed. And then marriage equality was a separate fight fought by a completely different group of people, and that was just sort of handled in the courts and happened pretty quickly because activists did a really good job and the world suddenly was ready to accept same-sex marriage. What I want to suggest is that there's a causal link between these two developments. And what I'm saying is mostly coming out of the US, but I think as I'm starting to understand the British situation, it's fairly similar. So the first major development in assisted reproductive technologies was commercial sperm banks, which arose in the 1970s. And major users of commercial sperm banks were lesbians who wanted to have babies without men attached to them. In the 1980s and 1990s, there was also a much noted surge of adoption from China, and many of the adoptive mothers were lesbians who always had to adopt as single mothers, not as lesbian couples, but nevertheless, you know, there were large numbers of women who became mothers in that way. Then what you had in the 1990s was the combination of IVF, egg sales, and commercial surrogacy. Banned in this country, but totally sort of Wild West in the United States. And it was that combination that allowed gay men for the first time to become parents in a real way. Gay couples have always had a very hard time adopting in most parts of the world. But what gay men could do was to purchase their eggs, hire a surrogate, and use IVF to create their children through that means. And you started to get, and you all know these cases because they're in People magazine, these sort of very high-profile gay dads. Ricky Martin had twins in 2008. Neil Patrick Harris had twins in 2010. You always get twins because it's cheaper that way. So as long as you're going through this, you just throw a couple in there. This is true, actually. Elton John had his first child in 2010, the second in 2016. These are really expensive babies. These are about $150,000 babies, which is why you want two. But what happened was that all of a sudden, and it really was all of a sudden, you had this surge of high-profile gay parents, particularly gay men, because lesbian women had been parents for longer. But it was gay men who really came out there both politically active, as the lesbian couples had long been, but crucially, what happened was that once you had same-sex families with children, the courts started to change their tune, because now children were not an abstraction. Children were real. So at this point, because the courts were they didn't know how to deal with same-sex marriage, they don't know how to deal with reproductive technologies, it all just confuses them. But what is very well enshrined in Western law is doing things in the best interest of the child. So when you now have a case where there is a family with a living present children, of course those children's best interests it can be argued are served by allowing their parents to remain together and be married. And it's called the doctrine of intent in the US, and I don't know the law here as well. But if you look carefully at the cases, that was when the law started to change. It was protecting the best interests of the child, because that was something that the courts felt comfortable with. And then if you look at the history of same-sex marriage from that perspective, the law all of a sudden moved really fast. And the place where a lot of the law changed first was in California, which is not in any way random. It's because California is the largest center of assisted reproduction probably in the world. And all of the surrogacy, all of the high-priced surrogacy takes place in California. So when California law started to shift, it created because courts run on precedent. It created a precedent that other courts could follow. So again, I'm happy to take arguments. I know this is kind of out there. But I think it's a really interesting argument to suggest, because it traces it back to the technological piece and shows how quietly technology was able to help push something along which on its own was having a hard time getting established in society. So if you then take it forward to the next step, and now I'm going to get totally wacky here, but if I'm right in suggesting that IVG is about to be the next breakthrough technology, then everything really changes, because you can have completely different combinations of parents creating an IVG child. There have already been 1 or 2 cases in Denmark, one in the US, but they're not yet dispositive cases. But these are cases where a child has 3 parents. And once again, if you have a living child with 3 parents, and you can say it's in the best interest of that child, either emotionally or financially, have been the early cases, to have 3 legal parents, the courts may very well move in that direction. So if you follow that truly along, it would suggest that the nuclear family as we know it is not going to be around for too much longer, that we will have different structures, and in some ways might even imagine going back to where we were before 8000 BC, where you had much more communal structures for raising children. And it's kind of interesting. One of the books that I found most incredible in doing this research is Shulamith Firestone, who wrote stuff that was really believed to be sort of way out there in terms of both feminism and Marxism. But her argument back in the 1970s, when reproductive technologies were just starting, was that reproductive technologies would get to a point where women were freed from their role as baby makers, and that's when you would get true equality for women. So I'm not sure I'd go all the way there, but I'd go pretty close. All right, now I will talk to you about robots, and then I will stop. Because the robot chapter was fascinating to research. And I will confess, I hadn't really known anything about robots before I started, probably because robot descriptions don't show up in political science. We don't worry about them too much. Usually they live in science fiction or very much in the tech space, where there's a lot of work. But when I started looking at it, what I found fascinating was that if you look at the historical record, we as a species have been creating robots almost since the beginning of time. And I'll give you a couple of examples of maybe not robots, but instances in which humans imagine recreating versions of themselves. Old Testament. Always good to start at the beginning. The Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living creature. God creates man in his image. The ancient Greeks had Prometheus, who operated very seriously. He was the son of Zeus, who formed men in the image of the gods. In Norse mythology, Asker and Embla, the first man and woman, were created by 3 gods. So the gods create man. That's the basic creation myth across just about every culture. In the 3rd century BC, there was a very well-known myth of a creature named Talos, who was an artificial giant shaped out of bronze by Vulcan, who marched along the coast of Crete to protect it from invaders. Throughout the Middle Ages, you see mechanical, animatronic figures, always representing humans or birds. And then, of course, the myth that we know most recently is Frankenstein. You know, the creator creating the creature in his own image. And just to quote you one passage from the book where I try to capture this. Whenever humankind begins to plumb the depths of scientific wisdom, whenever we learn more about how life occurs and what makes it work, we rush to apply that wisdom to the act of creation. We keep trying, in other words, to remake ourselves and to become somehow more godlike in the process. Until recently, though, all of the creations we made were decidedly crude. They were mechanical limbs, they were clocks that had moving figures. They had absolutely no feeling or thinking functions. They were just crude creatures. Since the latter decades of the 20th century, however, our machines, as you all know, have been becoming smarter and smarter, aided and driven by the rapid fire and apparently non-ending expansion of computing power. Okay, you all know this. I'll just give you one fact. You know, in 1993, which is relatively recently, the top-of-the-line Dell computer had a 66 megahertz processor, which is 66 million instructions per second. Today, the smartphones that every single one of you has in your pocket or bag right now runs at 2.33 gigahertz, which is 2.3 billion instructions per second, which is enough to put a man or woman on the moon, or more importantly, as we know, to tell us at any moment where we are in the world and where the nearest cappuccino is. As computers get smarter and smarter, as we all know they will, they are going to shape our lives and our worlds in manifold ways, most of which we can't even yet imagine. We kind of know, though, that over some period of time, soldiers will be replaced by drones. We're already seeing that in the shape of military warfare. We also know that manufacturing workers will almost certainly be replaced by advanced machine tools and robotic assemblies, with all of the social consequences that are going to come from that. We also suspect, those privileged of us sitting in this room, that professional workers, lawyers, doctors, accountants, even heaven forbid professors, will see more and more of what was once our expertise being supplanted by algorithms and other smart systems. JP was telling me earlier, surgery now taught online. That's just the beginning of where all of this is going to unfold. So all of these developments are complicated. They will shift society in excruciating and amazing ways. But what I talk about in the book, and what I want to talk about very briefly now, is the softer side of all this, and the possibility, and I would say the probability, that we will not only be protected and replaced by robots, but we will fall in love with them. So go back to your smartphone for just a second. Every single person in this room has a smartphone. It's probably sitting very close to your body. It knows who your friends are. It knows what you've confided in your friends, because you've confided it over your smartphone. It knows where you're going, where you've been, and with whom. It holds pictures of your most intimate moments and the keys to all of your secret accounts. When you leave it behind, how do you feel? Right? You feel scared. You feel alone. You feel bereaved. You're in love, right? It may not be in love the way you have a romantic love, but maybe the way you love your mother, right? Or your child. We are already falling in love with our technology. We're just not fessing up to it or seeing it in quite that way. Two other somewhat more dramatic examples. I went to Japan over the summer, and I spent time with an amazing Japanese inventor named Takanori Shibata. And Shibata has created a seal that he calls Paro. Paro is an absolutely adorable robotic seal. He is about the size of a baby by design. He has beautiful silky fur and very expressive eyes. You hold Paro in your arms, and automatically people hold him, they call him him, and they hold him like this, and he responds to you. So when you pat his fur, he rolls his little eyes up at you. If you tickle him under the chin, he sort of nuzzles against your hand. He feels real. And the way Shibata is using Paro is at nursing homes. So they take this seal to nursing homes, particularly homes that have patients with dementia. And I went, and they couldn't have faked this. It's incredible, because it's, walking into nursing homes with dementia patients, it's a painful experience. People are disconnected, they're not communicated, they're sitting there. They bring the seal in, and everybody responds. They start petting him, they start talking to him. They respond to him as if he's real, and they love him. Second example, in China, a couple years ago, Microsoft released a chat bot named Xiaoice. And this is, Xiaoice lives on your phone and just talks to you. So when you come home with a bad day, you can talk to her verbally or text it. Say, nobody likes me. And she responds, oh no, that's not true. Everyone likes you. And she goes on. And there have been all kinds of stories coming out of China that young men in particular are falling in love with Xiaoice. And as, this is my favorite quote, one smitten young man said, Siri is my secretary, Xiaoice is my life partner. Okay? And this thing is just on your phone right now. Imagine what happens when you combine a chatbot with an object like Paro or another robot, and you can start to see a pretty fundamental shift in our social relations. One other robot I'll just mention briefly. There's another robot that created in France, but it's now been bought by Masayoshi Son, the guy who owns SoftBank, and it's almost life-size. It's about this big. It looks like, if you remember Casper the Ghost cartoons, it's a friendly-looking robot that talks to you from like an iPad in its chest. They're using it to do some goofy things like Nespresso bars. You can order your cappuccino from the robot. But more intriguingly, they've had incredible success using this robot called Pepper as an educational instructor for kids on the autism spectrum. It turns out that kids on the spectrum respond much better to the robot than to a human. In part, they think because the robot never shows emotion, So even the most patient teacher with an autistic kid at some point is going to look at her watch or get frustrated. The robot never gets frustrated. So the autistic kids do better being taught by a robot than being taught by a human being. So we are undoubtedly still in the very early stages of the robot revolution, but I predict that we will soon start to accept robotic beings into our most intimate lives, accepting them as we have already accepted things like bread made in factories, which would have once been inconceivable, or even more strangely, children conceived in petri dishes rather than bedrooms. We've completely normalized for that. Robots are just a small step further down that technological path. So as I write in the robot chapter, we don't really know if our machines will ever become truly as smart as we are. We won't stop their evolution, though, or truly constrain the beings they decide to be, because we have created them. And like Vulcan and his Talos, Frankenstein and his master, God and his Adam, we want to let them live. And I think we will. So let me just conclude, and these conclusions are truly rough because, as I mentioned, I haven't written the book yet. But here's where I imagine I'm going to be going, at least in part. Luddites don't survive. In every one of these technological developments, there have been an active crowd of people trying to stop the development. And they don't survive. The technology wins out. And I think, and I was writing over this chapter on men, which I went in directions I wasn't imagining, but I think part of what we're seeing with the bizarre politics of Trump in the United States, and to a lesser extent here around Brexit, is that it's sort of a neo-Ludditism, that many of the people who are rallying behind Trump are actually rallying against technology. They just don't know it. There are people who are rallying against their present condition because they've lost their jobs and they've lost their career path, and they haven't lost those jobs because of immigration, even though they think they have. They've lost those jobs because of technology. And so we were getting a new form of Ludditism coming out, but history would suggest that these movements are relatively short-lived. There's very few examples of a breakthrough technology sort of emerging and then being put back in the bottle. There's just very few examples of that in history. The second conclusion I preliminarily want to make is a perfect one in this room and in the context of this evening, and it's that interdisciplinarity is crucial. Because I think if the technologists just talk to technologists and the feminists just talk to feminists, we miss all of the overlapping connections. And that's really, if you want to answer big questions, you have to be breaking down these disciplinary barriers because you just don't see enough if you're just looking within that narrow prism. And then the third and final conclusion I'll make is Marx was right. Again, strange for a person in my position to be making that argument. But going back, I think Marx and particularly Engels, who actually talked more about some of the early history than Marx does, I would certainly say that the policy prescriptions that they put out there have shown themselves to be tragic and miserable, but their analysis of history and the focus on the means of production as a crucial determinant of social and even family relationships, I think is right on. And I'm calling it Marx, but it's really Engels who writes on the family. And I think the arguments he makes, I think, really do stand the test of time and probably deserve a reconsideration. I don't know, I'm guessing things are quite different here, but you don't read Marx in American colleges really anymore, much less Engels or Lenin. And I think we should, because if we can move away from the policy prescriptions, I think as analysts of history, the framework they took, which was an interdisciplinary, deeply historical perspective, gives us an awful lot to learn from. So let me stop there, and thank you so much for listening to my truly half-baked ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We've got about 10 minutes for Q&A if you're happy with that.
Absolutely.
And I think there are some microphones. Dila has the microphones. So about 10 minutes. So who would like to ask some questions? I can't see people very well because
way in the back.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you. That was very interesting. I've got my first question is really coming to the robotics section at the end, which I'm just currently reading, Sherry Turkle's Alone Together, so I'm wondering what you think about Turkle's position on relationships, because really exactly what you've just talked about the seal and the various situations where actually the way that people engage with robotics, and her argument is very much, I guess I would summarise it as it almost closes down the potential that actually, and that things that certain groups of people attach to them easier because it doesn't have the messy unpredictableness of people. But she's very much coming from a position of caution, whereas you sounded more possibly optimistic. So I just wondered on that note.
Yes, and I'll just do one quick little side notice. It's very interesting when you look at the field of robotics, how many women are in it? It's very funny. You know, it's a very high-tech field. Generally, you don't see a lot of women, but if you look in particular at MIT, at the particularly the folks who work on assistive robots, they're overwhelmingly women, which I just think is just a sort of an interesting little sidebar. And certainly she's been in this field for her entire career, so I hesitate to say anything against her thoughts because she knows this world infinitely better than I do. But I am somewhat optimistic here. I think robots will evolve to a point where we don't worry about our interaction with them as much. And again, I would point to our cell phones. I think if you had asked any of us, because most of us were around 10 or 15 years ago, probably all of us were around 10 or 15 years ago, how would you feel if there was this thing buzzing in your pocket that, you know, had all of these things, functions? We would have been worried. We would have said, well, you know, somebody could get my photos and I don't want anyone knowing where I am at all times of day and I'm not going to share my personal information. And yet we kind of do, because we get more out of the relationship. And I think we will see that similarly with robots in certain spheres. You know, do I think that they will take over and we will have absolutely no human connection? No. And I think one of the beauties of what I saw with Paro, the seal, is that having the robot in the room also brought the humans together. And I said this in the workshop earlier, I think as we move more and more into a world of virtual realities, the premium on actual reality will go up. People want to come to live events. They want to come to groups like this. They want to go to cocktail parties. So I don't think the robots will take over human interaction, but I think they will become more like us. And then in the last chapter of the book, where I'm going to go truly out into the wild speculation, I think over time we will also become more robotic. And this is an argument that Kurzweil made and, you know, was sort of dismissed as being totally kooky 30 years ago, and is becoming more and more mainstream. And I think the beauty of what he describes, just in terms of the logic behind it, is we already accept robotic parts of our bodies. You know, we have contact lenses, we have hearing aids, we have knee replacements and hip replacements. We've shown no fear about adopting individual robotic components when it enhances our lives. That will continue, and some of the work done particularly in this country on neuroscience and the ways in which we will be able to start thinking differently about our brains as digital computers. I think there may be something, again, I wouldn't go so far as Kurzweil to imagine emerging in the singularity, as he calls it, but I would say it's an evolution.
Got it. Thank you very much for your talk. At the beginning, you describe sort of the understanding about the relationship between society and technology is somewhat limited, that there's not enough recognition about the, say, interwoven relationship between those two those two things. And you talk about technologists. I think there's a lot of validity to what you're saying, but I'm curious about academic fields like history of technology, sociology of technology, technology studies, feminist technology studies, and to a lesser extent, philosophy of technology. These fields have studied these relationships for decades at this point. So I'm curious about what role ideas from those fields play in your work. And then the second question was, the way you describe the relationship between society and technology is somewhat unidirectional in terms of causality, in a way that's sometimes referred to as determinism, technological determinism. The other direction, to put it very roughly, sometimes referred to as constructivism. So I'm curious about that second form of causality, what role that plays in this work.
Yeah. So on the first question, I think those fields, particularly history of technology, technology studies, I found those to be some of the richest and certainly useful areas for this book. So a fair amount of the work I've used here comes from those fields. I would and I don't mean to claim that I'm creating a brand new, field here, because you're exactly right. Lots of people have been doing this. They tend, at least in the United States, to be somewhat siloed. So the work doesn't necessarily make it out into the broader conversations. But I think you're exactly right. I think the history of technology is one of those fields that sort of was born interdisciplinarily. And it would be great if there were more work coming out of those fields. I think some of the feminist technology studies, and I don't know that area well, but I think tends to be narrower in its focus. For whatever reasons, narrow work is good too. In terms of the causality, at the moment, yes, this is a deeply deterministic argument. And some of the work I have to do is, once I can get through the substantive chapters, then I really need to start wrapping my head around the theory and really see the extent to which I think it's fully deterministic, or are there moments in which the causality runs both ways. And I think the substantive area I know the best is the reproductive technologies. And I think that is an area where you do see sort of the ebb and the flow. It's the science driving things, but of course the science is also responding to demands from individuals. So as you start to change the shape of marriage and families, that changes the kinds of things people want the technology to do, which in turn pushes the scientists to do things differently. So I don't think it's entirely a one-way street, but I just truly have not had the time to really think through the nuances of just how deterministic I ultimately want to be.
Okay, thanks. I think when you get to that stage when you want to do that, Edinburgh's a good place.
All right,
to go
good.
back
I'll
to.
come back. Thank you.
Okay, have we one more question? Yeah, right at the back there.
Thank you. It's okay. I can probably talk louder.
No. We need a microphone, madam.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. I think I agree with you that Marx was right. So I was just interested to hear a little bit more about how you analyze class in the three arguments that you're working on at the moment.
Yeah. So I've just started to wrestle with it, and the chapter where I really have been forced to confront it is the one on men, which I'll try and keep this short. I initially wanted to write a chapter that I was calling the daddy class, looking at the changing, shifting norms about men being the primary parents, primary caregivers, either in heterosexual or same-sex or single-person couples. But it wasn't quite going anywhere. So I started looking more at the deindustrialized economy, which has been a massive technological shift, and looking at how the effects of those basically the disappearance of the manufacturing sector is affecting men differentially than women. And of course, once you look at that, the biggest differentiator is not gender, it's class. So I've been really intrigued to look at the ways in which the deindustrialized economy is creating very severe class strata particularly among men, because women thus far have shown a little bit more flexibility in being able to retool to do different kinds of jobs. But I think those class distinctions are crucial. I do think they are a large part of what's driving some of our horrifying politics at the moment. And I think if you look particularly within the sort of primarily male jobs/careers at the moment, that's where you're seeing a massive striation between what I somewhat flippantly call the hoodie class. You know, the Silicon Valley, mostly men who are becoming phenomenally wealthy, and the much larger numbers of men who are under or unemployed. And part of what drove me to this is demographically, most men who are the primary caregivers are unemployed men. So I think in, you know, sort of the liberal circles that I hang out, the sort of the image of the new dad is a hipster Brooklynite who, you know, builds web pages from home while his wife is being a human rights lawyer. And there's some of that, but the vast proportion of stay-at-home dads are guys who had factory jobs who are unemployed now. And I think it's important to tell those stories, although I haven't quite gotten the framing right yet. But that will certainly compel me as I go through the other chapters to bring class in. The class, as you can imagine, plays a very big role in the Industrial Revolution story. But I need to think about it in even the robot piece as well, because certainly those who will have access to the robots and certainly to the robotic enhancements will be the wealthy.
Thank you. One more question?
Hello. Thank you for the great talk. I was just wondering, when you were talking about the present and then also in the future, so the present pertaining to female fertility and also with the egg freezing, and how at the very end you noted how that real equality between the sexes won't happen until women are freed from the burden or from the, you know, of childbearing. And so I was just wondering of when you're talking about those, just it can be pretty rough, but I was wondering about an estimate, a rough estimate of when you think that might happen, because that is in your present chapter.
And can you sign up?
And
yeah.
then also the future, and I was just like very curious because you said technology is coming so fast, and I was just wondering about that.
Yeah. Well, to some extent, it's here if you have the money. So I have a friend who wanted a few more kids. She's very wealthy. She didn't want to go through the burden of pregnancy, was perfectly capable of having a pregnancy, but she hired a surrogate, paid $200,000, got her twins, and never had to take a day off work. So it's there for enough money. Okay. Yeah. Now it doesn't, just so you don't go down that route without full disclosure, it doesn't solve the child care problem. Right, because even at the end of that, you didn't have the pregnancy, but you've got the two infants. But you know, surrogacy plus a couple of nannies with enough money starts to equate the two people in a couple, regardless of what their gender is. And I do think the last thing I'll say is one of the things that's I found most interesting, just sort of watching this field for a while now, is same-sex couples have been a crucial driver in shifting the norms around childcare and maternity care, because if you have two gay men who bring home a baby, they have childcare issues that aren't linked to maternity policies. So you've actually seen, at least in the US, more movement around flexible workforce when you start to get same-sex couples than you did with heterosexual couples, because now it's not associated with sadly, with a women's right. It's a parent's right.
I think I was just also wondering about like the IVG. Is that
IVG is going to say, yeah, don't bet on that one. Yeah, and even my public service announcement that I always feel compelled to make is, egg freezing is not a guaranteed technology yet. It's a bit of an insurance policy, and Mother Nature intended women to have babies when they were about 28. And so I always say women just need to know that and do whatever they want with it. But women's fertility falls off a cliff at about 35. So if you really want to have babies after 35, you have to invest in a lot of technology and a lot of good luck, because none of this stuff is guaranteed to work yet.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. We now have JP Singh will come and say a few words of thanks.
Thank you very much for being here. I just knew that if I had drawn up any notes before Debora spoke, so I would scrap them. So I drew up notes, I scrapped them, and I've put them back together again. I just wanted to call attention to 3 things you've done for us here, and 3 things that I think you are doing, which we really do need to take notice of. One is that I'm delighted to say you remain a social scientist. No, you're the president of the Lincoln Center for the Arts, but you're telling us under what conditions do things happen in a particular way. But you do it in a very Debora Spar way. In the early 90s, when I met you, you were at this panel where you were talking about under what conditions would multinationals pay attention to human rights, and you were talking about that spotlight phenomena. No, just when it was very easy to bash on multinationals and not talk about any possibility of where there were human rights, you called attention to, in a very nuanced way, in what kinds of industries it was likely to happen. I remember very well consumer goods industries, because he said, why don't we pay attention to minerals? Why doesn't media pay attention to minerals as much as they pay attention to consumer goods industries? Why is it textile sweatshops that we write about all the time and not something else? But you were nuanced and you were very careful and say, here are the conditions under which media can bring attention to human rights practices in multinational corporations, and you had particular regions where this was more likely to take place than otherwise. Similarly, you made us question our assumptions about this new world that we were evolving in technology and ruling the waves. And you pointed out that this thing has happened since the compass, that there's global rules that come about. So you are a social scientist, you're careful, you say, here are the conditions under which something's going to happen, but you do it in this Marxian way. No, in these bold sweeps of history which capture our imagination. I suffer from cognitive dissonance right now because the person I admired greatly who taught at Harvard Business School was Joseph Schumpeter, and he also paid attention to Marx. That's what he paid homage to. But Joseph Schumpeter said, Harvard Business School was going to basically kill business, because they're just not going to be visionary about it, and you're an antidote to that. So, I just think he was completely wrong. He borrowed from Marx, and we have Debora Spars who've shown us what entrepreneurship and that sort of thinking can do. And you're talking about technology as a set of affordances who can allow these sort of social relations to happen. And finally, you are a historian and a curator of ideas, of things, of apparatuses, of things that have happened and how they connect with each other. It's this, Debora has written so much, but you read her cases that she wrote for Harvard Business School, to the spotlight phenomena, to ruling the waves, the baby business, the way you make those connections is just amazing. So what you leave us with is a view of human beings that's bold. In the way we were, where we are, where we're moving. But it's your carefulness to human beings as human. And the pointing out of then the emancipatory possibilities as we interact with technologies, as we interact with each other. That's the optimist in you that I like so much, that at the end you leave us with, where could we be better beings, even when we're interacting with technology? And finally, I just really envy the fact that Lincoln Center has you now, and you left academia, but you really haven't. So this was really reassuring to people like me, that you'll continue to come back, because the world of art and the world of academia needs people like you. You're bold, you're visionary, you point out how things can be done, you go from technology to property rights to contracts, that you did in the workshop this afternoon, where those business practices need to change with technology and how they impact the arts, and then you point out these possibilities that seem to be endless in many ways. So in a world in which there's been a lot of doom and gloom, it's nice to have someone who'll remind us that we may have a better future tomorrow, and remind us in a way in which I was thinking, my God, that was 16 hours of Wagner followed by 3 episodes of Blade Runner, put together. So thank you for that. Thank you for coming here. Really appreciate it.